Welcome everyone to today's CSIA webinar series. My name is Colin Hammond and I will be your host today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with CSIA, we are a global nonprofit professional association with over 500 member companies in 40 countries. Our mission is to advance the practice of control system integration to benefit our members and their clients. Our vision is to ensure that manufacturing and process industries everywhere have access to low-risk, safe, and successful application of automation technology. CSIA membership offers members access to resources needed to attain and exceed business goals. To highlight just a few of our many member benefits, the CSIA Best Practices Manual guides control system integration companies in the setup and running of a solid company. CSIA's business insurance program offers members an excellent insurance program for business owners, subcontractors, and more. The program includes members from all over the world enjoying the peace of mind that comes with CSIA insurance. Clients in all industries are now seeking integrators with CSIA certification alongside ISO. They recognize CSIA certified integrators' commitment to industry standards and business acumen. As a result, being certified can shorten the sales cycle. CSIA Industrial Automation Exchange is the premier automation guide featuring system integrators and suppliers who provide industrial, manufacturing, and process automation solutions. For integrators and suppliers, it's a place to market their expertise. Clients will find white papers, case studies, capabilities, contact information, and engage in conversation directly with CSIA members. Please follow CSIA's online events calendar for all upcoming webinars, including partner webinars, business webinars, and our Wednesday webinar series. You won't want to miss these opportunities to learn from the comfort of your own office or home. And at this time, I would like to introduce our presenters, Mark Fondel and Jim Davidson. Mark has 40 years in industrial automation. His last 20 years were focused on Ethernet and Internet technologies deployed in manufacturing. He's the founder of Network Vision, which developed the IntraView software acquired by Panduit in 2015. Currently VP of Product Management, Remote Access at EI3, and President of ICT Global. Jim has over 43 years experience in plant operations with a strong emphasis in the project management, engineering, and maintenance automation space. Most recently, Jim held the position of plant systems and controls leader for Cargill Global Operations, managing 5 technical worldwide teams. And with that, I would like to now turn it over to Mark and Jim. Welcome, gentlemen.
All right, thank you, Colin. Looking forward to providing some information here. So let me first off say that I'm really happy that Jim Davidson has joined us in my career in developing products and so on. It's always good to have an end user who has a vision to where the market's going. And Jim has been one of those individuals that have always challenged me in the various areas to really make sure that we were on the right track. And so the working with Jim is really based upon both of us now starting to look at and giving back to the industry. And OMAC, which is really an organization on machine automation and control. And we were talking in regard to this and through a company EI3. EI3 is also an important element to this. EI3 was founded over 20 years ago from an individual, Spencer Kramer, who was running a systems integrator operation and doing work as a systems integrator using Siemens when I was back in the Siemens regional manager position. And he also saw the vision of the internet and how that was playing and focused a lot of his attention on developing a safe and secure method for OEMs. And so with what the experience that EI3 has had over the last 20 years and Jim Davidson's experience, what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about a work group that was formulated initially by OMAC, then also expanded to PMMI, and also now CSIA. So the webinar, the objectives of the webinar today, we don't have any of the answers. We're in the early phases of this remote services organization. So the goal that we're going to have is really to provide an overview of some of the detailed areas that we're looking at to investigate and provide useful information to what we call the ecosystem. And then lastly, and most importantly though, enlist several of the CSIA members to participate in the work group, because we believe that it's going to be very important not only to have an OEM and or end user experience, but also that of the systems integrator, because we believe the systems integrator is a vital component in this whole ecosystem. Now, initially the group was, or what I'll call the work group that we're building on the experience of a program that started in the fall of 2018 that was focused on remote access to plant floor systems. And so under PMMI and the OpEx Leadership Network, you'll see several companies on the right-hand side got together to talk about various ways to make a connection to a manufacturing plant. And thus they focused on several areas. They classified those areas, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen: direct VPN, converged network, cell modem access, black box, externally managed secure networks, and then the last thing being pretty much, traveling to a location and on-site technical assistance without the ability of having remote access. And this is a 24-page report that if you don't have, I would suggest either contacting me and we can get that to you. That talks a little bit about the various ways of making a connection into a manufacturing plant. The focus of our work group is to take that to the next step. What we want to be able to do is we want to now take the input from end users, whether they be IT organizations, corporate engineering, or plant engineers, with the systems integrators sponsored by CSIA, original equipment manufacturers that OMAC has as part of their membership, and then automation vendors that are typically also members of CSIA and OMAC. And we want to create a ecosystem of getting all the necessary input into this area of once I've gotten into the plant and I'm going to connect up to equipment, what are some of the areas I need to focus on? I like to look at it because when I get involved with talking to individuals in regard to remote connectivity and so on, and then you get into the area of the industrial Internet of Things or Industry 4.0, what I find in a lot of the conversations, and I've listened to a lot of presentations in this particular area, is that it has different meanings to different people depending upon where you are. It could be data analytics or version management or plant optimization and so on. And that's a very wide area. There's a lot of different things that you can do. You can pretty much go for 10 years trying to define all those particular spaces. We are not going to be doing that. Our whole focus of this work group is really dedicated on remote support. And so that's where we're going to be spending our time and in reviewing what are the essentials when remotely connecting to plant equipment. Another way of looking at it, and I look at it from a standpoint of when you connect to a plant, there's two different ways, either outbound information or inbound. What I'll call the outbound, or I'll classify it as data extraction, typically is where you would have certain dedicated objects. You would then connect them up, send them out to the cloud to multiple consumers of that information. That again is not what we are focused on. Our focus on remote support and service is on the inbound, where you would have an identified resource or resources that are required to come in and point to multiple or varied objects. Now, the characteristics of these two are completely different. Whereas in an outbound, the connection is mostly continuous, so the data is always flowing. It typically is a one-time network connection. It has minimal risk because it's outbound. Little or no local support required to continue that after the initial installation. And because it's only an outbound, little downtime or safety risks. What we find in the reverse side of this is when you make connections that are varied and random based upon failure modes and or needs to get into various systems, where you might have multiple connections, and those connections have to vary based upon which asset needs to be looked at. That generates major security risks. It also requires direct local support. And if you do things wrong, large amounts of downtime and safety risks. Now, Rockwell, and I attended a session, I think a month or so ago, had this slide, which I thought was very interesting, in that they have their OT managed services and return on investment. And clearly you can see that a large percentage of this time in fixing events is spent either finding or figuring out the problem, diagnosing the problem, and then finding the appropriate resources to fix the problem. And so I think what we're saying and what Rockwell's saying is right in alignment. And what we're looking at trying to do is really then to enhance this particular area and go from there. Now, what I'm now going to do is I'm going to ask Jim Davison to explain from an end user view what this means to an end user.
Yeah, it's interesting that we all go out and we listen to vendors tell us, we listen to integrators tell us, but as an end user owner, there were several idea sets that we started to look at and try to understand. My background comes from starting right there on the shop floor in the plant. And so I put together some ideas here that may or may not connect with you and your end users, customers. If you look at one of the things that we found was over 70% of these system failures in our plant we created ourselves, and it was usually an interconnection or a misunderstanding or a misfiring between both our IT and our OT organizations and groups and their groups that they had. In the Cargill space, we had over 250 integrators working in the 1,647 factories we had in the world. The next thing we looked at was automation system failures created millions of dollars of lost production. And it wasn't until probably in my second or third year that we began to look at and take facts in every one of the system failures that were over $1 million and reported on those back to the engineering management teams and to the production management teams. And we found that the big losses in our production were coming from loss of the system and then loss of not to spec production during that time that we had to redo. And then looking at it as an automation maintenance system, I came in with the background of rotating systems. So if you look at bearings and pumps and rotating systems, we had predictive maintenance, we had preventive maintenance, and we had break-fix maintenance. And we had changed that whole industry with rotating equipment. But in the automation system failures, in our space, we were finding that 99.5% of automation system failures were break fix, which were the costliest maintenance systems failures to react to and to solve, both in time and in money. So one of the beliefs that was very interesting in the plants was that most times an automation system failure was not a bad program or a bad code. Sometimes we had some system failures, but it was the field device or sequence not performing as expected. And the fact that our operators and sometimes our plant people didn't have the diagnostic tools available to them to help troubleshoot it. So they had to bring in some of the integrators, both in the IT and the OT space, to help them focus quickly to get resolution on what to repair. Not necessarily the program, but what unit or what device to repair.
Okay, great, Jim. Thank you very much. So let me continue on with sort of as we start reviewing things, I have a group that meet together of semi-retired people from the automation world, from companies like Ford and Miller Coors and General Motors. And we talk about a maturity model and the evolutions that are happening. And when we get into the area of remote access, for many, many years, there have been limited, if not zero access allowed to the plant floor systems. And then there became a limited one-to-one where IT allows maybe a VPN connection because of some issues and what have you. And then there could be the next step of this evolution is many-to-one, where various people, maybe within a systems integrator, are able to support a particular asset. And then the one-to-many, and this is where the OEM machines come in, where an OEM is supporting many machines either in the same facility or in multiple facilities. And we're reaching a point now as the COVID-19 and other things are creating need for more and more remote access to get into an area where we have several different companies required to go in and support the various systems. So this might be multiple OEMs focus on their own equipment. And then eventually what ends up happening is you have many different connections to multiple systems, and it can be quite complex. And so as we look at this and the need for IT security, it's going to start to become more and more challenging as many people start trying to poke holes into a company's firewall. So in the area of remote service and support, we are going to start to break down and look at the various mechanisms and organize best practices for identification of a machine or an automation problem, or identify and sending an invite. So once I identify I have an issue and I understand who it is, how do I send an invite to get that particular resource? And then once that resource gets the invite, creating a secure external connection and directing them to various multiple sources. If I need multiple resources to solve a problem, it may not just be one individual. And then to direct that resource to the appropriate machine or system, only allowing access to the appropriate and safe time to perform those actions. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Limiting connection only to the appropriate devices and not allowing individuals to go around through the network and look at other things that they're not appropriate in looking at. Terminating connections, we find that is an issue that we're seeing more and more of. And then documentation and validation of all actions that take place through a remote connection. So those are some of the areas as we start developing the work group, we're going to break down and start to identify the specific elements of that. So if I can explain that, I like to use analogies. An analogy that I like to use in this case would be external power. You have external power comes into the company, then to the enterprise, it gets into the offices and the printers and so on. And then it gets to the plant. Well, a plant has huge power demand, so power distribution becomes an issue. But when it gets down to the machine, then you have rules associated with power to that machine. lockout, tagout, arc flash, the separation of high voltage from low voltage in a control panel. Those are things unique to the machines in the manufacturing environment. We think the same thing is going to be true, instead of it being electrical power, connectivity, where the external connectivity that comes in from the outside that gets down into the machine will have access rules. And we're going to be looking at what those access rules are in order to have safe and secure operation when remotely connecting into those particular systems. So as we look at it, I have three elements that we're going to break this down into. One is going to be the incoming traffic, where we're seeing many different types of companies requiring, based on what's happening, access to information or their equipment that might be on the plant floor. Whether it was initially OEMs, systems integrators, now you have automation vendors and device suppliers, all looking at managing their particular assets and remotely getting to them if there is an issue. Then the second challenge is, once I get through the firewall, the variation in plant network architectures and how to really find that particular asset and how to determine if that is the correct asset. Now, I spent 15 years with the interview software, and we've essentially documented well over 3,000 manufacturing plants, and not any one of them was the same. And so this is an extremely important challenge as you start to look at inbound and trying to find where you can gain access to that system. And then once you have access to the system, again, as we talked about, is the procedures for connecting to these devices. And not only the procedures, but also recording all of the activities in a way that everyone understands that a access has occurred and who has done what to what system. Because there's always amnesia, and all of a sudden the plant system goes down, no one knows what occurred. And so you really need to have documentation as part of this overall effort. In this work group, what we're going to be looking at is the relationship with various people going through the firewall, in which certain aspects, so the OEM might have access to the machine itself, the OEM. The system integrator may support the PLC, the HMI, and the drive system, whereas the automation vendor that's brought in that in collaboration with the systems integrator may be looking at the PLC and seeing if there's an issue there, or with a device supplier to determine if the issue is the device itself, or as Jim mentioned, some type of failure, system failure on an input module or what have you. So as these devices become more and more complex, and they're not just on-off devices, but intelligent devices, the ability of being able to have multiple experts be brought in to solve a problem will become very, very important. The second level of area that I've talked about is the complexity in manufacturing networks. And everyone probably knows the CPWE architecture, and then you also have the IO networks that are out there. As almost all of the field bus connections are being made into Ethernet connections, you're having a very wide number of devices that are really connected to Ethernet in multiple networks. Another way of looking at it is, this is one application that I took an example from on the interview system, where we have multiple VLANs. And so there is 1,000 devices here, and each of these were broken up into smaller VLANs. For those of you that are looking at the network count, you're going to see 2 in some of these areas. And the reason there's 2 there is the fact that the design of this, the devices have not yet been added. They were proactive at setting up the VLANs, and then as these devices transition from traditional remote I/O to Ethernet I/O systems, they'll be populated. So you can see that this is pretty extensive. And when you get involved and talk to individuals about converged networks, this is where all of the devices will converge to a particular layer 3 switch. And so what you have here is these converged networks that tie into this core layer 3 switch or router, and then tie down into the various applications. And it could also then be OEM systems as well. But complicating that in even more so is that there are a large number of networks that are not able to be put into a VLAN. These are networks, IO networks, or networks where the IP address range is used over and over again. So for example, an OEM, and we have OEM A, each one of those machines uses the same network. It's essentially identical. And so those particular networks are isolated and put into these areas in the same way as IO networks that may use 192, 168, and so on are not routable. Now you can access it via a NAT, but the issue then is really creating connectivity and getting information from those systems. So the ability and what we're going to be looking at is these networks, not only the converged networks where you have everything going to a core layer 3 switch, but all of the networks that make up a manufacturing plant. So the procedures we're also going to be looking at to remotely connect to the devices really start to look at organizational and job function. Who can initiate an outside assistance request? Whether that needs to be escorted or unescorted device operations, meaning I have to have someone at that device when someone is remotely connected to it. And so we need to look at that part. The classification of the activities that might be done on a device, whether it's version management, program changes, problem issues, or what have you, classifying those so we can understand how they would fit in, and then the methods for properly validating and targeting these particular devices. And so, as I mentioned, this is part of what the work group is focused on, is the ability of being able to sort of isolate or segment and identify the various areas and issues that we believe need to be at least identified, if not resolved, and or put together a best practice when looking at that. Now I'm going to now pass that back over because I would like to have Jim spend a little time on this from a user point of view. Jim, are you there?
Yep.
Okay.
So as an end user owner, many of these type of issues impacted us and cost us money and loss of operations. One of the, and remember I talked about earlier the slide where many times the 70% plus, we would hurt ourselves. And so some of the issues that came forward that we would start seeing on these quarterly reports were an improper patch or an operating system upgrade was applied. So a workstation would get a patch to help the Windows product, but it unfortunately had not been worked on or tested against the operating system of the software we were using to control the process. Changes were made to only maybe one component in the automation system that caused incompatibility issues. So again, an IT group came in and made some changes, an OT group was there doing some work, and one component of the system was upgraded, the other component was not upgraded, and then when you attempted to run it, systems locked up. Changes were applied. It was very interesting. Changes were applied many times in a system by one part of the organization that required a system reboot after the changes had been applied to those particular servers or workstations. And in doing so, sometimes those changes would actually create an automatic reboot, and that would take and allow us to unfortunately run our production lines either without visuals or have to shut down the production lines for that period of time during the system reboot. many times changes were put in when we had minimum support staff on site in the plants. One of the questions I would always talk with when I wanted to work with the right integrators, both in the OT and the IT, I would ask some of the IT people, if you had the option of making your changes, would you make those changes Friday night after 6 o'clock, or would you make those changes Tuesday morning after 10 o'clock in the morning? And those that had the business thoughts, business side of the approach in the IT group would choose, hey, I'm going to take it offline during the weekend. Those that had the production and plant side, since a lot of our facilities ran 24/7, would pick Tuesday. And they picked Tuesday because, interesting enough, you got through all your Monday problems, your staff was prepared and rested a little bit, so if something happened, you could take it on. Interesting enough, sometimes when we made changes, the change would go to the wrong device because so many devices and so many plants were the same IP address, and people didn't fully understand that they had to be in a particular plant. And because many of our systems were replicated across many of our plants across the world, and the fact that in some areas we had very flat networks. And so in one case, we had a person making changes to a boiler in Kansas City on the PLC, when in fact they were really changing the PLC on the boiler in a plant in China. And that created a real dangerous situation in that particular situation. Applying changes that were not tested in an offline environment. One of the key things that I wanted to use my integrators on was, before we put the actual programming in the field, let's test it in an offline environment. Even though the vendor says the program will work, Microsoft says the program will work, the other component in the security system say it'll work. The first time we ever checked it, and I still remember one of my plant engineers called me up and I said, well, how do you do this when you don't test it offline? He says, well, what you do is you run it in your backup server first. And if your backup server takes it, then you're in good shape. And I said, man, that is just so risky. And in fact, we started to make changes where we would build test beds to actually test an offline environment. And then changes are made outside of the plant sometimes by unskilled or poorly trained contractors on staff. Sometimes of those 250 integrators we had, both in the IT space and the OT space, some we elevated to an area of, I'll call them trusted integrators, and others were just a local guy in the small little garage operation in the middle of Czech Republic who may not have ever done that type of process before, and in fact would take down a poultry plant or take down a very necessary facility for us. So once I'm down, one of the questions I ask is, well, how do I get help to troubleshoot and get back online? So now I've got an issue. So in the system designs we're looking at is, how do I get experts that can easily access multiple pieces of the control systems, the networks, the switches, the servers, the workstations, the controls, and the PLCs, but yet do it in a way where my IT organization and parts of my OT organization are still comfortable with the fact that we haven't just broadly opened up the whole system to the world. I want the experts to be able to quickly and easily narrow in the troubleshooting process to the key devices or programs to analyze to figure out what's creating the failure in the system. I need to have access to the proper expert and the experts, sometimes both being online at the same time, to view that same online process and see how that process reacts to determine whether it is a problem with the machine or it's a problem with the devices. And then I need to keep others from accessing and only allow IT and OT and system experts when necessary and required. And one of the things that we really seriously looked at was, how do we keep the door closed into our facilities unless We want to open it up for people to get into and to do their work. And then once we let them in, how do we build that single tunnel so that they can only go to that particular device we want them in and avoid some of the other issues we saw in the earlier slide?
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. So we're going to get now into sort of the next steps. So I'm hoping that everyone has seen a little bit of a framework of where the focus of the work group is going to be. We're really trying to look at not how you're going to do it, but the methods, the applications, the things that we think are going to be important for gaining remote support, and then we want to then also make sure that the amount of our insight that we have here so far isn't missing a particular area. And in doing that, what our first step of the work group is going to do is generate questionnaires that are going to be sent out to as many companies as possible to get the feedback and their current state and their interest in moving forward. Now, the questionnaires are going to be targeted to the entire ecosystem. We're going to set up questions specifically to an end user, maybe the end user, the IT department of a particular company, or the OT group within a company, and those questions will be different. We want to try to get a point of view from both of those. We certainly, you're going to see that we're going to be providing questionnaires to all of the systems integrators interested in participating to get feedback as to your experience. We really believe that you are a good sensor on what's happening. It may not be in not only the large companies, but the mid-size and smaller companies that you support. We really want to be able to understand their issues. We don't want to overlook because we're influenced by a Cargill or a General Motors or Ford or someone like that. What we're interested in looking at is all the various companies that you may support, and make sure that we understand the resource restrictions. We understand all the various elements of that. So that's what we're doing. Also getting information from the OEMs, because the OEMs are somewhat different. An OEM usually has a common group of equipment that they use for their application, whereas an integrator is responsible for a much broader spectrum of various products and services, and may focus on an application, but with a variety of systems based upon legacy systems and so on. So, but we still want to get the information from the OEMs, and then also the vendors. We want to make sure that we're in alignment with all of the vendors, and make sure that their inputs are gathered as well. And then from the information that we will have collected, we want to take the results of those and also input from the members of the work group to organize and segment this into various areas. So we want to sort of organize these in topic areas, and some of the people in the work group may have a better understanding or a focus in that particular area. Some that I'm not really familiar with that, and we'll give this to another group of individuals. So we want to be able to segment that so that we can do some deep dives into some of the key topic areas that we think are resonating with the ecosystem. And then once we do that, we want to then divide those topic areas into subgroups so that we can then parallel process these activities to reduce the time. We don't want to have everything sequential and they come out 2 years later with this report. Nor do I want to rush through something and find out it's on the surface and not as deep as it needed to be. And then another element of this, and this sort of came out with some of the discussions we've had within some of my advisors within ICT Global, was there are differences in the market and maybe differences by company in requirements. We want to take into consideration that and maybe separate some of those best practices that might be geared to one type of market versus another. And then lastly, the group is looking at interfacing with the participating organizations. This is CSIA, OMAC, PMMI, the OPEX group, and the various companies. It's really amazing that all the companies, as we started talking about this work group, all had an interest of going here, and all are very much interested in having a collaborative effort. And so what we need to do is not be influenced by one organization or another, but also to work within those organizations to make sure that we're developing the appropriate deliverables for their members as well. And so that is the basis of what we're going to be looking at doing with the work group. Now, I always like to look at it and say, you know, what's in it for you? I mean, you're sitting there saying, okay, why do I need to do this? Well, what we're going to do is anyone that participates in the surveys and provides the information for us as we're collecting it, we're going to take all that information, we're going to correlate it, put it down into a general trends, and provide you with the results of the surveys that are coming out. So you can actually see the viewpoint. There won't be names of individuals or companies. It's just going to be surveys that are focused on the various issues. So you can see based on, and if you keep a copy of your survey, you can then see your position with respect to all the others that are going on in that particular area. For any company that wants to join OMAC, and then with that to become part of the work group, it's not a very expensive element. I could talk a little bit about that. I think it's less than $1,000 to join. The work group, we're going to try to get together every other week for 45 minutes. We're going to start to collect all the information as much as possible and not have this as a major time constraint on any organization. We think it's going to be important that we are very efficient. I have an agreement from a company that's involved with Lean and developing process for coming out with it's a sort of an agile process to go out and focus on specific areas, organize it, and structure it. So as this particular company, if we get together with, will help us develop the agile methods to be able to come out with results very quickly. And then lastly, what we think is going to be important for you is that the material that's created, you can take and customize your offering based on your capabilities or how you see your markets and segments. So we believe that through CSIA, this is going to provide a good ability to understand remote access, a lot more of the details of specific interaction with machines and processes from a much broader view of individuals, not just the integrators, but OEMs, end users, and hopefully vendors that are participating in this particular system. So we're at about 45 minutes, which I can't believe we're pretty much right on schedule. And I think the last 15 minutes, Colin said, was going to be, taking your questions and seeing if we can answer things that you might have at this point in time. But I thank you again for attending this session here.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we have, it looks like a couple just kind of broad questions. Oh, they retracted it. So it looks like it got answered. It was mostly how do you sign up, how often you plan on the work group to meet, and you went over that. So we have another one. Siemens, Rockwell, and Cisco are working on remote support solutions. Do you see this work group competing or complementing their activity?
Yeah, I try to attend as many of the sessions as I see here, and I think it's very complimentary. We're not focused on what is best, and there are companies that use Cisco in their plants. There's other companies that use other switches and what have you, and so we want to, and same thing with Rockwell and with Siemens, and we want to make sure that our focus is really on access and security and safety of the equipment, and not necessarily, the total solution. We're also seeing other systems integrators developing their own. They're seeing themselves as being a little bit different. They're not as large, but they have the ability of being able to handle a lot of different devices rather than a specific brand. And I think that's one of the values that the systems integrators offer, is the level of expertise. There's a lot of knowledge leaving many manufacturing companies. And I think the systems integrators fit a very unique position to be able to have that level of expertise. The challenge for systems integrators is, travel. How can I expand my reach to various locations and what have you? And we think this is going to be a way that the integrators are going to expand their business, because instead of getting on a plane, you can link up to a particular facility and provide valuable knowledge and experience in problem solving, and not have to incur the costs and or the risk in traveling to a particular location. But I think it was a great question.
As an end user too, let me comment on that. One of the things that we would drive would be vendor agnostic in a conceptual way. And I don't want to go out and have to buy 2, 3, 4 different ways to come through that particular firewall to get into the system. I want to drive myself and the integrators out there down to a style of system or a concept of system that limits the number of holes I'm punching through that firewall.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have another one. Our company is a member of CSIA. Do we have to join OMAC as well to be involved?
You don't have to be a member of OMAC to be involved in providing the answers to the questionnaires and getting the information on that. OMAC, who's started this operation, is looking at having a membership to be part of the work group. But I can certainly take a look at this and address that. But initially, it is an interest to be able to have the members that are in the work group be OMAC, but that may not be. There's always exceptions to the rule. So certainly we can talk about that as time goes on here.
Okay. How do you see system integrators bettering their positions with large companies by adopting the guidelines being worked on with this work group?
Jim, you probably best answer that one, I think.
Say that again so I can.
Yeah, so how do you see system integrators bettering their positions with large companies by adopting the guidelines being worked on with this work group?
Okay, we'll put our phone down there. I talked earlier in the slides about Cargill being a large organization, 1,650 facilities, but each one of those facilities sometimes was a small little plant. It had been a small little plant. We had integrated them and brought them together. And so one of the things that helped us was by making sure that our idea sets between the system integrator and the owner end user facility within that cultural environment and area we were working in were very common. And we think that as we have these type of developments and procedures and rule sets and idea sets being put together, versus we can do it one way in this facility, we can do it a different way in this facility, it will allow lower cost for the end user owner, and it'll also allow less time in the sales channels with the system integrators to say, okay, have you seen this? Have you agreed to this? Yes, I'm part of that. Yes. And all of a sudden the connection is made, and it'll speed up the process of installing and putting in these type of systems to securely be able to access the facilities by the system integrators in the outside world.
Yeah, if I can go a little bit further on that, the way I look at this is that what we're trying to do is create, very much like CSIA has best practices and standards. We think that that by creating a similar type of standards in regard to remote connectivity, that larger customers are going to be comfortable in the fact that these standards are adhered to. Just free flow of, you know, connecting a device or getting a Wi-Fi connection or a cellular link for an immediate fix may work today, but as issues start to arise and security hits are occurring, or the IT organization starts to clamp down on all these methods to bypass the core firewall, they'll have issues. And I think that by creating a very good, well-defined and documented set of requirements, I think the IT organizations will become less confrontational to OT. I think they'll have looked at this and seeing that there are differences in the requirements of an OT organization based on responsiveness, that I can't wait and have the permission have to go to an IT group to get some type of emergency resolution on a problem that may take 2 days for them to get back. And so, so we think the process that we're going to go through is going to be extremely helpful in at least identifying what the issues are, bringing out the various ways that they can be achieved, so that that all companies can be aware of these and put them in a consolidated location, and not be differences. If I talk to this company, they have a different set of priorities. This company has a different set, and so on. So we want to try to make this agnostic. We want to try to make it inclusive, and so that everyone can benefit.
We have another question. If we already have a remote support offering, do we need to abandon it?
No, I think that as we're looking at the ability, I think what you need to do with any of the offerings is take a look at you know, how that offering is going to need to be adapted to some of the requirements that may come in there. So you may have to have some enhancements to that. So we're not saying one way is the only way to go with these types of systems, but by looking at some of the analogies that we talk about, as far as having a connection to multiple devices at the same time, and or having different resources limited to specifically looking at different pieces of equipment, you know, your solution may need to be looked at as to, can I achieve those types of objectives? And this whole world is changing. Everything is moving in this direction. So technology will shift. What we're trying to do is lay out some guidelines so that equipment manufacturers or vendors that are developing and building these types of connectivity products understand the true scope of what is required when connecting up to machines and automation systems on the manufacturing floor.
We have another one. Have you looked at netfield.io? Hilshire has introduced a remote monitoring and management system for edge devices and containers.
Yeah, as I said, the issue, there's a lot of devices that are out there. The Opto22 has an Epic system and whatever. A lot of the information on those are outbound, and that's why we try to delineate that. Those outbound connections are different than what our focus is. Our focus primarily is on remote support connectivity into these particular areas. Now, having said that, the structure will most likely evolve, that once I have a structure set up for remote connectivity, can I use that same pipeline for external access, or externally acquiring data from the plant, or having it pumped outbound? and that'll happen, I think, as well. And but there are a lot of solutions that are out there. I think all of them are compliant, but our focus is primarily on remote support.
We have another one. This looks like the final one. If you have any more questions, I think we have a couple more minutes, so please put them in the Q&A. Will you address the challenge of a system integrator being asked to provide this capability but not getting paid for it?
So
well, if you think about it, the end user is going to look for that particular service. And they're going to look at the different system integrators out there that have or don't have that particular service. Those that have the service will provide better benefit and safer ways to interface to the end user facilities. It also will allow the integrator to be able to get over that hurdle that Mark talked about that says the IT group tends to be the ones that do a lot of the blocking in the process. And in fact, if we have agreement between what this group comes up with in the way of standards and processes and the IT world as an organization, that's going to make it much easier for system integrators to be able to apply their components, their pieces, their solutions into that particular end user's world to get in there, troubleshoot, and get the plants back up and running quicker.
So I think the other part of that question is that if a systems integrator, and this is more of a functional element, if you're called in to a problem that's on the plant floor, that this machine is not working properly and what have you, are you paid for that? And if you are, then the question is what does it cost you to do that, especially if you have to send someone there to travel out there and spend the time, versus I have a mechanism or we're work with that company that allows us to easily connect up and have the appropriate device connected up so that we can remotely look at that, because the individual that is necessary to solve that problem is somewhere else, but may be able to get an hour or two online to be able to provide some assistance. So the question should be, I think there, as an owner of a systems integrator, you have to look at how do I make money from this, and then also how can I reduce my cost while providing additional capabilities and service and support. And I think that as this happened, and I'll look at the analogies which were put in the earlier phase. The doctor-patient in this now telemedicine, they were very reluctant. Doctors were very reluctant to be able to do anything. They wanted patients to always come and visit, and that created issues with the patient getting sick in the office or in the lobby or what have you. But as the shutdown created this telemedicine, doctors were realizing that they could see a lot more patients and be more effective at doing this. And so the whole attitude of security or having that one-on-one face-to-face was broken down. The same thing is true with teachers and the classrooms. Now, we were told in New England here that there may no longer be a snow day, because if there's snow and people can't get to the classroom, they'll just do it virtually. And so I think the systems integrators, as I pointed out, they're the doctors, they're the teachers, and they're the suppliers of systems. And it's going to be very important in this new wave of being able to take advantage of this type of remote connectivity, not only to pull data from the plant and putting up for OEE and nice graphics and so on, but also the support on that break fix, where there's a huge amount of costs on downtime. And both, you can see both Rockwell and Jim's statements saying it's one of the most costliest things that could happen is I've lost the production on a particular line.
Thank you, Mark. It looks like that's gonna be it. On behalf of CSIA, I would like to thank Mark and Jim for this informative discussion. We hope you found this informational. I'd also like to remind you that a recording of this will be available for viewing tomorrow. That will be available, and to please visit the CSIA website to view another past webinar that you may have missed. We do have on the online events calendar, I think 6 or so webinars coming up, so please take a look at that and be sure to register. And that concludes our program for today. Once again, thank you, Mark, thank you, Jim, and thanks to all those that attend.
Thank you.
Good.